The challenge, I suppose, for them, which one has to recognise, is the fact that they're coming into a completely different culture from the one that they're used to. Probably a culture where the pedagogical approaches are quite different. Certainly that the culture they're living in is very different. So there are lots of different things that they're having to learn. They're not only having to learn new stuff that relates to their PhD studies, but they're having to learn how to live in Glasgow. They're having to learn all the intricacies of setting up a bank account and finding a new flat and all that sort of thing, which takes quite a time in itself. And so one has to be aware of that there are a lot of challenges that you probably don't have yourself that they're having to adapt to coming here. But also they're probably likely to be away from most of their family. And many of the international students that we get are students who are a little older, who've got their own families. And it takes an awful long time often to find out that that's the case, because they're often not revealing that they've got a daughter or a son back in their home country that a grandparent is looking after, who's maybe only 2 or 3, who they've had to leave. So they're making enormous sacrifices to come here.
I think when supervising international students, there are some things that I'd perhaps be a little bit more aware of. They're not vastly different from supervising home students, but it's probably even more important to listen really carefully and watch. And listen, for example, to whether they use the same language back with me, with my co-supervisors, as I'm using with them. If they're not using that same language back, is it that they haven't understood it? Watching their facial expressions to see whether they're really getting the sense of things, and asking, well, you know, do you know that word? And if they do, they can just say yes. But I think it comes up too, even just with North American students who've got a completely different language for many of the concepts we use in a normal supervision sort of session. So what does a viva look like is completely different. Do we talk about supervisors or a committee? And so many of these terms are quite different, and they have carry different meanings. And so sometimes it's important to explain how things work in the UK, just so that there isn't confusion at a later stage.
I think for an international student, you cannot ignore the fact that language is often a barrier. They come with appropriate language qualifications, but this isn't always practical or scientific language. And so trying to check your communications clear is an important aspect. And making sure your student understands. There is, in some cultures, a big emphasis on deference from some students. And so they would really hesitate to question a supervisor.
Consistently having regular meetings and setting deadlines so that I can really see that what we've discussed in the meeting comes back to me, and I can see whether they've understood it and how they've taken that meeting and progressed forward is really important. Yeah, the regular meetings and deadlines is absolutely key.
We all use acronyms all the time. Little things like that. And they won't it's realising that they will not understand what you're talking about with the best will in the world. Of course they won't. So you've got to think yourself as an internationalist. And I suspect that so many people in the UK don't see themselves as internationalists. They talk from the perspective of where they are, their own country, rather than talking in and using an international language.
I don't personally treat international students any differently to any other students. The same principles I use for them, the same as everyone else. Obviously with international students, they may well have different backgrounds, so they've probably got a little bit less practical skills in the laboratory, which maybe needs a little bit more attention. Sometimes maybe a little bit more attention needed with writing or presentation skills. But generally speaking, no particular differences. I think one of the, perhaps the only thing I've found that one does need to overcome with international students is getting over the sort of deference culture that they sometimes have. where it takes in their countries, I think sometimes professors are seen as sort of semi-gods, and it takes them a long time to get over the idea of not calling you professor whatever, and to actually call you by your first name, and to develop that sort of personal relationship, which I think is crucial for supervising a PhD.
There are different things, different concerns at the very start. Obviously the first one is language. So they may have very good English, but they have to consider then academic English. So I often encourage them to go to academic writing sessions and things like that. The other issue is the culture. Sometimes they come from completely different cultures and their education systems are very different. So it's a matter really of having that discussion as to what we expect from them and what they expect from us.
With international students, they're very interesting to supervise. Often they've got strengths that differ from home students. You certainly don't want to stereotype, but it might be quite typical that students from certain countries have got a very strong background in mathematics, for example, stronger than we'd expect our own students. And I think playing to those strengths is important. It helps the student feel that they're really valued.
I think there's sometimes a sense as you get towards the end of a PhD that often they've come away from home and they're very keen to get home. And I've often had a sense that they want to rush a little bit at the end because they're so keen to be back with their family or back into a kind of their working life when they get home. So that for me sometimes means that they lose the perspective of realising that there is a whole process that takes place once the thesis has been handed in. So the realisation there's a delay sometimes before there's a viva, and then the viva may not be the end. And I think sometimes it's really important that we take the time to explain to students that it's quite normal that you might get some changes to make and that they might take a little bit of time. So it's the calculating of the extra time that you might need after the hand-in. And another thing that sometimes students forget is that from the point where their thesis is ready and they want to pass it to you to comment on, that's going to take you some time to feed back to them, and they need to factor that time in. So there are quite a lot of delays, I think, towards the end of a PhD, and whilst they're the same delays experienced by all students, I feel that international students are to some extent slightly less patient to want, to finish it and want to craft that sort of perfect PhD, if you like, that they're ready to go home often. So I think that's something we need to be much more explicit about, explaining those later stages and how long they can take.